So if you really want to be value-based, if you really want to move past the performative stuff, park talking about DEI and start sharing all the action you're taking, because the actions will speak louder than any of the words you've got to say on DEI.
Why is intersectional thinking important in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the workplace?
Intersectional thinking is absolutely critical to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And the primary reason being because when you understand how inequality works, you understand why we need to consider all areas of difference. So very quickly for everybody, inequality works in a way that organizations really value one way of leading and one way of working over everything else. So we find in most organizations, when you think of what the ideal worker or leader is, it's going to be someone who's dominant, assertive, aggressive, competitive, and even exclusionary. And it also tends to be somebody who's white, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied, and male. So we overly index on that type of worker and really associate that with leadership and competence. So why does that matter from an intersectional lens? Well, intersectionality was originally created by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was a way of really accounting for Black women's lived experience and how that lived experience was different than necessarily any other woman's. And I think you can take sort of the general ethos of that way of thinking and apply it to all areas of difference, because the more you as an individual differ from that ideal worker in terms of your behaviors and in terms of your demographic characteristics, the more experience of inequality you're going to have. So to advance a culture that's diverse and inclusive, we need to understand difference in different lived experiences. And that starts with getting to know, how does inequality show up for you? How is that different for you? What are the different ways you differ from that ideal standard? And how does that create day-to-day experiences of inequality, like harassment, discrimination, microaggressions in your workplace? So to solve inequality, we have to see it. That starts with seeing our differences.
How can business owners ensure their DEI strategy includes people from all minority groups, like the LGBTQ plus community and people of colour?
So it's absolutely critical to account for all areas of difference. So when you are building a DEI strategy, I think the starting point is understanding, well, how people in my organization experiencing the culture. So when you understand that inequality is made up in the day-to-day experiences we have of our workplace, the behaviors we engage in, the interactions we have, you understand that we actually all contribute to other people's experiences of the workplace, which means we all contribute to other people's experiences of inequality. So to understand how inequality is showing up in your workplace and what it is we're valuing, what it is we're devaluing, we have to start by asking people and understanding how they're experiencing the organization. So a good way to do this, and to make sure you're being as inclusive as possible and accounting for difference in your DEI strategy, I really recommend leaders do something that's quite important. So I would recommend you sit down with your team and ask them the following 5 questions. The first would be, hey, what does inequality look like in our team? So how does it show up in our day-to-day interactions and experiences? How are we experiencing inequality? It might be harassment, discrimination, microaggressions. How's this showing up in our team environment? The second question would be, what would a culture that really values our differences look like? So let's really define that, right? So what would an inclusive, diverse, equitable workplace culture or experience of our organization look like? The third question would be, what am I not doing as a leader to create that environment? And what do I need to start doing as a leader to create that environment? So question 3 and 4 there being really looking at how leaders drive culture through the behaviors they're engaging in, the behaviors they're rewarding, the behaviors they're endorsing. Why is that important? Because a Catalyst study shows us that 46% of employees' experiences of inclusion are directly attributable to their line leader. So if we want to change this equation on DEI, we need to start with leaders, right? So asking those 2 questions is important. And then finally, I would try to enroll everybody in it. So I would say, look, what are 2 to 3 things we can do in our team, in our department, in our function today to start building that type of culture? So as a leader, if you sit down and ask those 5 questions and enroll everybody in your team, not only are you going to account for different lived experiences of inequality, but you're going to enroll everybody in trying to solve the problem.
Customers want to see that the businesses they financially support share their societal values. There is a fine line between authenticity and performative activism. How can businesses communicate their values with authenticity?
So here's the thing, if you are an organization that is truly value-based, you don't necessarily need to communicate it. So what do I mean by that? Well, we often have organizations, we saw this with Black Lives Matter, we saw this with the Me Too movement, where companies come out with these big corporate statements, CEOs stand up and talk about all the ways they support Black lives, all the ways they support women. What happens? Well, very quickly that's followed by employees tweeting or posting on social how their lived experience as a Black employee, as a woman, isn't great in that organization. So what I always say to organizations is absolutely internally get clear on what you value and why. Have that be your North Star in terms of guiding behaviors. So help people understand, hey, how do our values translate into a set of behaviors? And make sure your policies and processes are set up to hire, reward, promote individuals who align their behaviors to those values. But when it comes to your initiatives and how you're taking action, your values will show. Your values will speak for themselves. People will know what your organization's about by the action that you're taking. So in the DEI space, I think one of the challenges is there is so much performative talk and very little action. And actually employees now know this. And as a result, I mean, I share a lot of this in Forbes and the articles that I write. We're seeing studies come out showing high rates of fatigue, backlash, denial, basically exhaustion with all this DEI talk and no action. So if you really want to be value-based, if you really want to move past the performative stuff, park talking about DEI and start sharing all the action you're taking, because the actions will speak louder than any of the words you've got to say on DEI.
What message do you have for businesses who are not already investing in their diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So I'm a metrics person. I have spent 20 years studying metrics, specifically in the DEI space. And look, I think one of the things we know about organizations and the current state of DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that companies tend to over-index on demographic diversity. So there's a great 2020 McKinsey study that came out showing workplaces are more diverse but less inclusive. So what does that tell us? It tells us we are preoccupied with making it look like we value diversity when in fact we're paying very little attention to the lived experience. So this is normally where somebody, when I give a talk, will raise their hand and say, but Michelle, how do you measure the lived experience? You can measure the lived experience, right? The lived experience is, what are the day-to-day moments of inequality that show up for me? What are the behaviors my leaders engaging, the behaviors I'm engaging in, the behaviors my teammates are engaging in that create inequality? And so for me, the best way to summarize that is barriers. So in my book, I share 17 barriers that show up for women throughout their careers. I highlight 6 that show up for men. And these are lived experiences of inequality that you could very easily create a survey from. In fact, I've done this myself for many companies. And so I encourage people to think about, how are we measuring the moments that matter, the moments where inequality shows up? Because it's not enough to get diversity into your organization if you're not going to value it. What's the point? Because those people are just going to leave. So we have to start valuing the diversity we bring to organizations. That starts with valuing difference and different lived experiences.
What do you hope people take away from your speeches on diversity, equity, and inclusion?
In the last 18 months, I've spoken at 482 events. Why is that important? Because for me, I think every single event, I judge whether or not it's successful based on what people take away from it. So I want people to either have a mindset shift from what I share or actually understand how to apply what I'm talking about, ideally both. And I think, what sets my sort of general talks apart is I have a theory of change that I follow in the talk. So I'll start off with raising awareness, because some people might be in denial that their organization has inequality or that they maybe need to adjust how they're behaving. And then I'll bring some understanding in as to how inequality shows up specifically in your organization, what to look out for, how it affects you, how it might affect your career. And then I'll share specific actions people can take. Why does that matter in a talk? Because the challenge is often you'll see a lot of DEI speakers sit in a really performative space. They talk in platitudes, they do a lot of awareness raising, a lot of scaremongering, and people come away feeling a bit overwhelmed by the problem. Well, people are tired of talking about the problem. They want to understand, hey, how does this show up for me at work? What does it mean for me? How do I do this every day as part of my job? And more importantly, how do I take action to drive meaningful change in my workplace, to not only make my workplace work for me, but to make it work for everybody? And so that's what I hope everybody takes away. And I think what really sets me apart maybe from other speakers is my research. So I've spent 20 years at university. I've never left, and I tried to leave and then they brought me on as a fellow. So I'm never leaving. And I think when you understand organizations in that way from a research lens, a lot of the research I'm sharing is my own. And, studying inequality for 10 years, the research insights I'm hoping are really helpful for people to bring it to life and understand, wow, this is real, this affects me. And I really need to understand how I'm applying what Michelle's sharing. So every talk, you get some actions, you get things you can apply every day.